It's doing a thing you can't see.
Oh, right.
Yes, we are live now.
Okay, excellent. So welcome everyone to the final keynote session of GIFCon 2023 Boundaries and Margins. Just a few housekeeping details before I introduce our speaker for today. First of all, this session is being live streamed on YouTube and will be available to view on the Center for Fantasy and the Fantastics YouTube page afterwards. We are also making use of Zoom's automated captions for this session, which you can turn on and manage in your private settings, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just a heads up that the auto captions can sometimes be a little bit creative in terms of what they think that we're saying in the session afterwards. We are also making, just be aware of that. Please remember as well to observe the GIFCon Code of Conduct and Netiquette at all times during the session. And there will also be a Q&A portion at the end of this keynote session. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A box, which you can also find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Sami Schalk. Dr. Schalk is an associate professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the author of Bodyminds Reimagined, Disability, Race, and Gender in Black Women's Speculative Fiction, and Black Disability Politics. Dr. Schalk's academic work focuses on race, disability, and gender in contemporary American literature and culture. She also writes for mainstream outlets, including a monthly column called Pleasure Practices in Tone Madison. Dr. Schalk identifies as a fat, Black, queer, disabled femme, and a pleasure activist. So Dr. Schalk's talk today will be drawn from the book Bodyminds Reimagined, and will explore how science and speculative media can challenge our understandings of social issues and how these new understandings can expand our imaginative potential and be applied to real-world work for social change. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Schalk.
Hi, thank you so much, Taylor. I am coming to you from outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, where I am visiting family right now. So I am in my teenage cousin's room. As an image description, I'm a fat Black woman with short curly hair, wearing a blue shirt and blue and other kind of colored glasses. So I'm going to be sharing my screen to do a little PowerPoint presentation where there will be some images as we go through here today. Okay. So as we said, the title of today's talk is Reimagining Bodyminds and Liberation in Pandemic Times. I'll be using this PowerPoint with a black text and light purple background to help you follow along. And I'll also be providing image descriptions when images are on the screen. So today I'm going to read some excerpts from my book, Bodyminds Reimagined, Disability, Race, and Gender in Black Women's Speculative Fiction. And then I will go on to talk about the role of speculative fiction and imagination for liberation, particularly in pandemic times, using an excerpt from my current book, Black Disability Politics, which was published last year by Duke University Press. So I'm going to begin with reading from the introduction of Bodyminds Reimagined. We recently made Bodyminds Reimagined open access. So on the screen, you will see the QR code. If you want to scan it, you can access this book now completely for free and download the individual chapters. This is a new development, so I'm really happy that this is now available to everyone. The cover of the book is currently on the screen. It features a mixed media art piece with a Black person looking to the left who has most of their body and half of their face covered with rusted gears, wires, other tech items, and feathers. In the background, there's a city and a blue sky with white clouds, and the title and my name appear at the bottom of the cover. So this is now an excerpt from the introduction to Bodyminds Reimagined. Confession. I was not initially a fan of speculative fiction. There, I said it. Of course, I now know the error of my ways, the misconceptions I held about the geeky male whiteness of the genre. I now know how ill-informed I was in my belief that speculative fiction was escapist fluff that had nothing to do with my real-world investments in fighting oppression in order to find or create new, freer ways of being in the world. But then I read Octavia E. Butler and quickly realized that this genre I had dismissed, this genre I had been able to avoid throughout most of my educational career, was far more diverse, compelling, and politicized than I had ever imagined. Reading Parable of the Sower, I began to understand how politically astute speculative fiction can be, how it can comment on our world and make us imagine alternative possibilities, the good, the bad, the ambivalent, and the downright terrifying. I quickly consumed everything Butler had written, every novel, every short story. I even bought an expensive copy of her out-of-print book, Survivor, after getting my first check at my first tenure-track job. Reading Butler changed the way I read, as well as the way I think about text and the world. I never met her, but her fiction is now as familiar to me as my own memories. And now that I have spent time in her archive at the Huntington Library, she has become a long-lost friend whose complicated life, incredible drive, and exquisite prescience has often brought me to tears. Reading Butler led me to the world of Black speculative fiction and Afrofuturism, to feminist speculative fiction and queer speculative fiction, to new conferences, new colleagues, new friends, and ultimately to writing this book. Butler's work led me to ask questions like, what does it mean to imagine disability differently from the stereotypical stories of pity, helplessness, and victimhood, of evil, bitterness, and objection, of non-sexuality and isolation, of overcoming and supercrips? What would it mean to imagine disability differently from these dominant cultural narratives we typically encounter? What might it mean to imagine Blackness differently, womanhood differently, sexuality differently? If, as Gloria Anzaldúa claims, nothing happens in the real world unless it happens first in the images in our heads, then changing the narratives of disability, race, and gender, changing the way marginalized people are represented and conceived in contemporary cultural productions, can also change the way such people are treated, talked about, and understood in the real world. Speculative fiction allows us to imagine otherwise, to envision an alternative world or future in which what exists now has changed or disappeared, or what does not exist now, like the ability to live on the moon or interact with the gods, is suddenly real. For marginalized people, this can mean imagining a future or alternative space away from oppression, or in which relations between currently empowered and disempowered groups are altered or improved. Speculative fiction can also be a space to imagine the worst, to think about what could be if current inequalities and injustices are allowed to continue. Marie Jacober writes that, quote, "The great gift of speculative fiction is that it makes us think, and specifically, it makes us think differently. It makes us examine things we had never examined. Even better, it makes us reimagine things we thought we knew," end quote. The Black women writers in this book have made me think differently, examine text differently, and imagine and reimagine disability, race, and gender in ways I never had before. In honor of Butler and her work, and the many writers that her work led me to, I begin this book with the often stated and hashtagged assertion that representation matters. In material, concrete, and life-affirming, life-changing ways, representation matters. So in order to demonstrate the theoretical approaches that I talk about throughout the book, after this introduction, I then use a recent example from popular culture, well, recent at the time of the book, called The Girl with All the Gifts, which was released in the UK in 2016 and in the US in 2017. And it provides a useful demonstration of the importance of terms like body mind and disability, as well as for the need for intersectionality and crip theory in the analysis of disability, race, and gender in non-realist representations. So now I'm going to read from my analysis of this film from the book. And this is on the screen is an image of the movie poster for The Girl with All the Gifts. Set in a near future England, The Girl with All the Gifts is a modern take on the zombie apocalypse genre. The film opens by introducing the audience to Melanie, a young Black girl who is confined in an institution for reasons initially unknown. Melanie wears an orange hooded sweatshirt and sweatpants reminiscent of a prison jumpsuit and sleeps in a bare locked cell with only a cot, a wheelchair, and 2 personal photos which she keeps hidden. When Melanie is taken out of her cell, 2 guards appear, one who keeps a gun pointed at her at all times, and another who straps her into the wheelchair for transport across her legs, hands, and head. On the screen is a still from this moment in the film that I just described, with Melanie in the wheelchair and a guard holding up a gun pointed at her. Melanie's cheerful, kind greetings to each adult she encounters stands in stark contrast to the fear and hatred directed at her and other children in the institution. Twice, an officering guard calls them friggin' abortions, and later another refers to them as creepy, questioning how the teacher in the film, Miss Justineau, can stand to be so close to them. The children in the institution, primarily white boys besides Melanie, wear the same attire and are strapped into wheelchairs in the same fashion. They're all taken and left strapped in their wheelchairs into a classroom. So a still from this moment is now on the screen of all the children strapped into the chairs in these orange jumpsuits. Miss Justineau, who's at the front of this classroom on the screen, is the only person who seems to regard the children with any compassion, and she is particularly fond of Melanie. At one point, after Melanie shares a story that she wrote, Miss Justineau reaches out and gently caresses the top of Melanie's head. Melanie's closed eyes and deep breath in response suggest that she is rarely, if ever, touched. In this moment, however, the head guard, Sergeant Park, burst in to yell at Miss Justineau for breaking the rules by touching Melanie. He cautions her that they are not truly children at all. To demonstrate his point, Sergeant Parks lifts his sleeves and spits on his arm. He then places his arm in front of a boy in the class who begins to respond in an animal-like fashion, growling and straining to bite him. Quickly, the other children on that side of the room respond in the same way. This is the audience's first indication of what's going on in the world of this film. After the scene, the film slowly reveals increasing details about the situation outside of this institution. We learn that much of humanity has been wiped out by a parasitic fungal disease that takes over the brain, creating hungries who roam abandoned cities and attack living creatures, human and animal alike. Hungries have gray, decaying skin and are mostly dormant, seemingly lacking self-awareness. They stand still in large groups for extended periods of time until they are awakened, so to speak, primarily due to the smell of non-infected beings nearby, as well as when there's sudden movement or a loud sound. When awakened, hungries are both fast and strong, and they spread their disease through bodily contact. The institution where Melanie and the children are kept is at once a military base to protect uninfected humans and a research facility. The children there, we eventually learn, are being monitored and studied in order to understand the fungal disease. This includes killing some of the children to dissect their bodies in the hopes of using their brains and spinal fluids to create a cure. Unlike the hungries who roam mindlessly, these children were born with the disease and their brains have a more symbiotic relationship with the fungus. So while they are carriers and need to eat raw meat of some sort, in the institution, we see Melanie fed a bowl of worms, and later she eats a cat and a bird. Children born with the disease are otherwise able to speak, learn, move, and behave like other humans. Not long into the film, the institution is attacked by hungries. Melanie escapes with Miss Justineau, Dr. Caldwell, Sergeant Parks, and a guard named Kyrian. A still from the film at the start of this journey is on the screen with the adults holding guns and with helicopters in the sky in the background. While Parks and Kyrian wish to leave Melanie behind, Miss Justineau and Dr. Caldwell insist on taking her with them, the former because she truly cares about Melanie, and the latter because she just needs Melanie's body to create a cure. The rest of the film involves the group traveling throughout this dystopian wasteland, and as they travel, Melanie learns more about her disease, its effects, and how to survive. Body mind is a useful term in analyzing The Girl with All the Gifts. Melanie's brain, what we would consider the home of the mind, is covered in a fungus, which causes her to crave flesh and, when hungry, temporarily lose awareness and self-control. While her body remains externally unchanged, she appears to be faster and stronger than a typical child. It is impossible to refer to her disease as merely physical or mental alone when hunger, typically considered a very physiological process, results in dramatic mental effects for her. Melanie's body-mind is holistically impacted by the fungus. Similarly, disability, with the DIS in parentheses, as an overarching term for disability and ability, and the contestable borders between these categories, is also an appropriate term for the discussion of this film, particularly from a CRIP theory perspective, which includes illness, disease, and discourses of disability in its approach. If not for the institutional setting and the way that the adults in the film treat her, Melanie would appear non-disabled and in some way hyper-able. She is smart, observant, and physically strong and agile. As the film progresses, she better understands that when she becomes hungry, she needs to eat raw meat quickly to avoid harming people around her. Melanie is essentially the heroine of the film. To the majority of the adults around her, though, she is too different and too threatening. She must be confined, studied, treated, and cured, or used as a cure for others. People around Melanie question her very humanity and her status as alive, conjecturing that she may be merely mimicking human behaviors instead of being truly a human. For example, the head researcher, Dr. Caldwell, tells Ms. Justinu, quote, that they present as children, but the fungus does their thinking for them, end quote. In the world of the film, Melanie is treated as disabled, and dangerously so, because she possesses the threat of both death if she were to eat someone, and contagion if she were to bite or touch them. The fear of contagion here is very much about disability, as this disease is incredibly disabling to adults. The tension between Melanie's fresh-faced innocence and her danger to the adults around her is palpable throughout the film. The unclear and shifting disability status of children with the disease, however, becomes particularly evident when Melanie discovers a group of them who roam as a feral pack to attack people and animals. So a still of Melanie interacting with these children with her shirt and face covered in blood, growling at someone off the screen is now on screen here. While the children are dirty and lack language, since they had no education as Melanie did, they appear to be able to communicate with and take care of one another. What constitutes disability in this context? It becomes increasingly evident that the world is changing, and Melanie and children like her are much more likely to survive. The world that the adults once knew, our realist world, is all but gone. As the world changes, what is and is not a disability changes as well, revealing an essential part of reading disability, race, and gender in speculative fiction: the importance of context and interpreting the text within its own rules of reality. But The Girl with All the Gifts is not exclusively about disability. We cannot understand the nuances and registers of this non-realist representation if we don't read intersectionally. The immense and militarized fear of these children and their disease is racialized by the choice to make Melanie our protagonist. She is the only child of color depicted and one of 3 people of color in the film with speaking lines. She's a Black girl surrounded by white people as she is imprisoned for medical research in a military compound and then treated as a prisoner as she travels with the others. While her race is never directly commented on, her disease and the fear it invokes in others becomes a metaphor for racialized fear. Shortly after their escape, Park insists that Melanie be handcuffed, muzzled, and strapped to a gun turret on the roof of their military vehicle rather than ride inside. Ms. Justinu exclaims, quote, "She's got a muzzle on her face and her hands tied behind her back, and you're still afraid of her?" And Park replies, "Yeah, and you should be too." On the screen is a still showing Melanie in this clear muzzle mask. Although the film is set and was produced in the UK, its allusions here to anti-Black police violence and military violence, which is far from exclusive to the United States, is striking. Numerous incidences of police violence have been justified through claims of police officers fearing for their own lives, even when the person who was injured or murdered was handcuffed, restrained, outnumbered, and or significantly smaller than the police officers involved. As the film moves towards its end, Dr. Caldwell makes a desperate attempt to create a cure by playing on Melanie's emotions, telling her that if she agrees to the dissection, she can save Miss Justinu's life. Melanie seems ready to agree, but first asks what will happen to the other children. When Dr. Caldwell doesn't respond, Melanie asks if she thinks that the children with the disease are merely mimicking human behavior. Dr. Caldwell says no, and they have the following exchange. Melanie says, "We're alive?" Dr. Caldwell, "Yes, you're alive." Melanie, "Then why should it be us that dies for you?" In this moment, Melanie refuses to sacrifice herself for the other children. This explicitly flips a frequent trope in horror, thriller, and action films in which characters of color regularly act as martyrs, valiantly dying to save the white protagonist. The scene also rejects the trope of disabled people being cured or dying at the end of a film or novel. Instead of sacrificing herself to save Miss Justinu, the only person who has ever shown her love, Melanie leaves the trailer they are hiding out in and goes to set a large plant of the fungus on fire, which will release infectious spores, creating a massive, if not worldwide, epidemic. By releasing the spores, Melanie initiates a new world in which she will no longer be considered disabled, dangerous, or abnormal due to her disease. This choice allows for an undetermined future for Melanie and the children like her, yet also means sacrificing the lives and freedom of the adults with her. Dr. Caldwell and Sergeant Park both die chasing after Melanie, and Miss Justinu must live permanently in the airlocked trailer or she will become infected. Melanie's decision to release the spores is represented as an emotional one for her, but one that she makes with clear determination. The final scene begins with a close-up of Miss Justinu's face as she lies in bed crying. There's a knock and she gets up. Outside the trailer, Melanie organizes the children from the institution and from the feral group that they encountered earlier in the film. On the screen is a still showing Melanie standing in the middle of the children sitting on the ground with Miss Justinu inside the windows of the trailer in the background. The children sit in rows on the ground facing a large windowed area so that Miss Justinu can teach them from a loudspeaker inside. When Miss Justinu tells the children that she will tell them a story if there is time, Melanie speaks the final words of the film. With the sun and a smile on her face, she responds, "There will be lots of time." The film ends here with a young Black girl who is considered dangerous and disabled by the adults around her, now beginning a new world for herself and people like her, in which their body minds and their differences will not be considered disabling, dangerous, or animalistic. At the end of the film, it appears Miss Justinu will have to spend the rest of her life in that trailer, and it is unclear if or how this group of children could create a lasting society for themselves. The film thematically draws on discourses of disability as well as more subtly discourses of race and gender to create empathy for both Melanie and Miss Justinu in this simultaneously dark and hopeful ending. The Girl with All the Gifts is a useful popular culture example which demonstrates the utility of my key terms, body, mind, and disability, and my primary theoretical frameworks, intersectionality, and crip theory in interpreting disability, race, and gender in non-realist representations. Throughout the rest of Bodyminds Reimagined, I explore how Black women writers of speculative fiction reimagine the possibilities of body minds and thereby change not only the rules of reality for these non-realist worlds, but also the rules of interpretation, requiring modes of analysis that consider both the relationship of disability, race, and gender, and the context which give these terms meaning. While the intersectional relationship of disability, race, gender, and other vectors of power are important to consider in representations of all kinds, speculative fiction provides a particularly interesting and important avenue for interrogating the social construction and mutual constitution of these systems of privilege and oppression. So I've shared this excerpt from Body Minds Reimagined to show how I approach analyzing social issues represented in speculative fiction, or in this case, film, in the book. I believe that speculative fiction has important liberatory potential that is often overlooked and dismissed. My interest in the genre has always been in regard to the way that it can represent and engage with social issues. Since publishing Body Minds Reimagined, I've started using the term visionary fiction. This was a term that was coined by Walida Imarisha and Adrienne Marie Brown in their edited collection Octavia's Brood to refer to social justice-oriented speculative fiction. The cover of that book is now on the screen. In Octavia's Brood, Imarisha writes, and this quote is on the screen, "When we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is speculative fiction. Organizers and activists dedicate their lives to creating and envisioning another world or many other worlds. So what better venue for organizers to explore their work than science fiction stories?" I share this quote often with my students when we read speculative fiction because it encapsulates so much of what I value about the genre. So much of the world around us is science fiction in the present. In the wake of a global pandemic, climate change, and war, it feels like dystopian and apocalyptic fiction come to life, and has for several years now. In many ways, it's overwhelming and scary. But when I say the world around us is science fiction in the present, I don't just mean our technology. I also mean us as people. As a Black, queer, disabled woman with a PhD, I am science fiction, an unimaginable being for some people, say 50 years ago. And yet here I am. Many of you, as marginalized people, have done things and exist in the world in a way that is fantasy come to life. And that to me is powerful. I am here because of organizers and activists who have dared to imagine that Black people and women and queer people and trans people and disabled people deserve to be educated and be safe from violence, to speak our truths, to share and create knowledge. And when the existing world around them says that those things are impossible, we do it anyway. All organizing is science fiction. We are living and working in a political and social moment where our ability to creatively imagine, sorry about that, my phone. We're living and working in a social and political moment where our ability to creatively reimagine how to do things, particularly liberation work, matters deeply to our collective futures. So now I'd like to share an excerpt from my current book, Black Disability Politics. An image of the book is on the screen. It's a very simple cover with just the text in yellow with red bars and my name. Very simple, as well as a QR code for the open access version of this book. So this book is also available open access, free to download. I have paid my press lots of money to make these two books open access, so please use them and share them. So the excerpt from Black Disability Politics I'm about to read comes from the conclusion where I discuss how organizers in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, creatively reimagined how to organize and protest safely during a global pandemic. And it reads, on the screen is a photo from the uprisings in Madison. I am writing these concluding thoughts in the midst of a global pandemic, and now what I've begun to call the uprisings. Everything is surreal, everything feels urgent, nothing makes sense, and yet I still feel compelled to write, to finish this book. When the pandemic began to shut things down in the US in March of 2020, I watched my disabled friends and colleagues offer immense knowledge to the non-disabled world on how to move events and meetings to virtual platforms, how to find and wear masks properly, how to keep your mental wellness intact during long periods of isolation, how to make your own hand sanitizer, how to connect with others when you cannot touch people or leave your home. Disabled people led the way in showing folks how to care for their full body minds through a pandemic. And then the uprisings began. And again, knowledge about organizing from a variety of body, minds, and spaces emerged from disability justice communities. Here in Madison, I joined Freedom Inc., a Black and Southeast Asian queer feminist activist organization for which I am a board member, for a large march on May 30th, 2020. Alex Shabazz, a Black disabled queer woman organizer, asked me to be a care bear for the event, someone who distributes food, water, and, in this moment, masks, gloves, and hand sanitizers to protesters to keep everyone safe. My friend later told me that she learned about care roles in protests from disability justice organizers. Several of us acting as care bears, security, and medics communicated in a group chat all day. That night, some community members continued their own protest after the march and property downtown was damaged. Madison police showed up in riot gear, as pictured on the screen, pepper spraying protesters and bystanders in the way, creating chaos, harm, and trauma. The city issued a curfew and the uprisings officially arrived in Madison. Those of us in the original security and care network for the march continued to work together privately, slowly, organically growing our network to include trusted friends. As local organizations and individuals planned protests and marches day after day, week after week, our network of over 30 people worked in the background to ensure as much safety and care as possible at every event. What amazed me about this organically formed network, this organized non-organization, was the incredible leadership and participation of disabled people, particularly Black disabled people. Some of us could not risk being out in public with large crowds. So instead, we stayed up late monitoring live streams from protesters on social media and using information gathered from the streams to communicate with our people on the ground about where to send medics, where to send supplies, and where to avoid the police and National Guard. Others still would listen to police scanners, privately fundraise, or make runs to grocery stores and pharmacies for supplies. For a while, it felt like the state was explicitly at war with us, and we needed every person, every skill to help our people stay safe as they expressed their righteous anger and demanded radical change. Defund the police, abolish prisons, forgive student loans, put a moratorium on rent and evictions, value people over property, all echoes of the demands of the Black Panther Party decades before us. Days later, the curfew was lifted and the police and National Guard reduced their visible presence downtown while still leaving snipers on buildings, undercover officers in our marches, and tanks on the edges of town ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. At that point, some of us chose to be on the ground, but in our cars only, participating in caravans that shut down major intersections and highways, and at other times, serving as physical protection for marchers by driving in front of or behind the group. There were so many roles for a variety of body, mind, and access needs, and each of these roles were valued among my network. This was my first time doing so much on-the-ground protesting and organizing. I had just finished writing everything for this book except for the conclusion, and I found myself constantly identifying Black disability politics in our work, even as they were rarely named as such. Now, however, I'd like to frame them as disability political practices here and document the crypt brilliance that made the uprisings as successful and sustained as possible as they were here in Madison. As I drove in front of one march, I thought about how keeping a slow pace with lots of stops for people to rest is not only a safety practice to keep the group together, but also a disability justice practice to make marches more accessible and refuse to leave behind those who move at a different pace than the majority. At multiple protests, I distributed free water, food, face masks, sunscreen, and/or bug spray from a collapsible wagon I now just keep in my car at all times. On the screen is a photo of me during one protest where we shut down the highway with our cars. I'm pictured in a green dress and sunglasses, smiling, holding a megaphone while pulling a red wagon with a box of supplies behind me on the highway alongside cars lined up as far as you can see into the background. This choice was, in one sense, an adaptive practice for my own body-mind because I knew I couldn't carry very much at once. So the wagon allowed me to be more effective in distributing throughout a crowd without hurting myself. More largely, though, I often thought about the holistic nature of Black disability politics and how providing food, water, face masks, and other supplies directly connects to the need to practice holistic care for people at protests, especially when folks are new to such events and perhaps uninformed on how long an action can last. We also had medics on site, plus one member of the group carried essential oils and tinctures for folks needing help calming down or grounding when things got hectic or scary. When we care for everyone's body minds, more people are able to participate for longer periods of time with more energy and joy. Finally, in my network of organizers, I witnessed people named their self-care practices and access needs more openly to the group, such as, I need to take today off. I could come to the march, but I need someone to stay with me. Or, I'm running low on energy. Can someone let me ride in a car for a while? While not everyone identified as disabled, I was regularly impressed by not only the naming and responding to these needs, but the active celebration and encouragement of disability justice access practices. Once, I was going to be late to an event because I couldn't move my therapy appointment. I said so, and not only did folks adjust without question around my timing, people also responded in the group text with comments like, "Yay, therapy." This kind of atmosphere allowed me to bring my full self in whatever capacity I needed at the moment into the work. I rarely heard people use the word disability to help explain or politicize these various practices, which I'm now framing as Black disability politics. I believe that there's value in naming these as disability political practices because doing so makes care work for self and for others political and valuable in a world that often feminizes and thus devalues it. Further, if we create a Black liberation movement that understands Black disability politics to be essential, then these practices would be non-negotiable for all organizing, activism, and protest work, fighting legacies of burnout and overwork culture that allow ableism to flourish. By explicitly naming practices already occurring in many Black movement spaces as disability politics, we recognize and value the role of disabled people in Black liberation work. It is time for all Black people to claim Black disability politics as one of the many tools that we need in the fight for our collective freedom. Right now, admittedly, it is hard to imagine what the future looks like. The days blend together and the pandemic rages on, seemingly unabated. I was writing this in June of 2020. Black people are dying at disproportionate rates from COVID, and for those who survive it, it will be many years before we truly understand the long-term disabling impact of the virus on our communities. Black disabled people deserve to exist and exist well into the future, and that can only occur if Black people and our allies follow the lead of multiply marginalized disabled people who have watched from their beds, from their homes, from the bus, from hospital rooms, how non-disabled people operate, pretending that these body minds of ours will last forever, that this earth of ours will last forever, as if we do not have to slow down to support each other, to account for, let alone learn from, those we have historically isolated, ignored, and let die. Disabled people know how to survive this. On the screen right now is a piece of art created by Asian American trans disabled activist Lydia Brown. It shows 4 disabled people of color and has the words "Honor Mad Crip Mad Disabled and Neurodivergent Wisdom and Genius Disability Justice Now." Our knowledge is part of how we as a collective not only make it to the other side, but also build a new world that is more capable of responding with care for all of us, not just some of us. What I see emerging in this moment is a time for Black people to embrace disability politics explicitly and consistently, a moment where following the lead of Black disabled and other disabled people of color who have survived and organized within hurricanes, days without electricity, wildfire, smoke hazards, tear gassing, pepper spraying, COVID-19, and more, is our best hope. When this ends, and I do hope this particular crisis ends soon, we cannot go back to the way things were. Based on both my research and my lived experiences during these uprisings, I believe the future of the Black liberation movement and its longevity depends upon its ability to incorporate Black disability politics. This cannot be a politic only held and enacted by disabled people or when disabled people are visible at a protest. It must always be a part of planning and executing this work, always. That's the end of that conclusion from Black disability politics. I'm just going to wrap up now. The pandemic has forced us to be creative in how we work, how we connect, how we organize, and how we create change in our communities. It has been 3 years now. We are continuing to innovate. I believe that reading and engaging with visionary fiction in particular helps us use our imagination to create more and more just futures, to imagine new methods for reaching these futures that we want to see, like accessible organizing and protesting. It is easy to see what has to go in our world, what is failing us, what is broke, but it is sometimes harder to imagine what it would take, what could take its place, what we would need to do to create a world where all people can thrive. How do we get there? I believe that visionary fiction and radical imagination are useful tools to those of us trying to create more just and equitable worlds. Speculative fiction is not merely an escape. It can also be a roadmap to something better. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon/evening. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Sami, for that really brilliant and illuminating and very moving talk. I'm sure you're seeing all the applause and heart emojis and comments in the chat. So we'll now take questions. A reminder that if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A box. We'll start with a question from Maggie, who says, would you be willing to briefly discuss crip theory in your own words? I've come across it and I'd love to hear your overview because you put things so well.
Yeah, so crip theory, this term comes out of disability studies. Carrie Sandall and Robert McGrew are some of the folks that really developed it in the early stages. And it essentially kind of borrows from and blends disability studies and queer theory. So it's an approach to disability that approaches disability similarly as queer theory approaches queerness, right? It's not an embodied identity alone. It's also kind of an orientation to the world. So it's cripping something, it's shifting something, it's paying attention to non-normative bodies in ways that kind of expand us beyond very simplistic identity-based definitions, right? So it's not simply about, in the case of speculative fiction, right, which is why it's really important and useful for me, it's not about, is Melanie disabled, right? Is the zombie disabled? It's not about proving yes or no, but thinking about the way that disability as a concept is being engaged, and ableism as an oppressive system is being engaged in these representations. So crip theory helps us do that, to move beyond just looking for there's a disabled person, there's a disabled person, kind of doing that like diagnostic thing in especially literature and representation, but thinking more holistically and broadly. So it's not about, again, defining particular identities, but taking an approach to looking at the discourses more broadly.
Thank you so much. And yeah, as you said, it is kind of comparable to the ways in which queer theory kind of troubles that notion of whether somebody is or is not queer, but rather thinking about queer, or in the case of crip theory, disabled ways of understanding or ways of being or viewing the world. I had a question which I think chimes with the question that Andy has put in the Q&A box, so I'll kind of roll them all together. One of the things that I really appreciate about the work that you do in Bodyminds Reimagined is the attention that you give to how speculative texts and reimaginings of disability and race and gender also involve different horizons of pleasure and possibilities for pleasure. So could you speak a little bit more to the role of pleasure in political work? And Andy also asks, could you speak a little bit more about the role of righteous joy in sustained activism, and maybe how we can chart this relationship through speculative works?
Yeah, so my engagement with pleasure is really grounded at this point in the work of Adrienne Maree Brown, who's the author of Pleasure Activism. Highly recommend if you haven't read it. Short version of what pleasure activism means is it's the politicization. It understands pleasure to be political. Who receives pleasure more or less is a political issue, right? Whose pleasure, think about whose pleasure is shamed, policed, criminalized, disregarded in some way, and whose pleasure is lifted up. Examples that we can think of, for example, might be the fact that in the US, homosexuality was in the DSM for many years. We have current bans for trans folks and on drag. And we can also think about, oh gosh, the other one went out. Oh, I know. Another example that I use is like when we talk about guilty pleasures, thinking about like what is considered a guilty pleasure and what are the kind of racial, class, gender associations with it. Often people talk about like reality TV is my guilty pleasure, right? But we don't hear people being like, going to Shakespeare plays is my guilty pleasure. Like no one says that. So there's certain ways that class and race and all these other things are associated with what pleasures are appropriate and not, as well as who deserves to have pleasure. So as a pleasure activist, I believe that incorporating pleasure into our work and valuing pleasure, highlighting the political nature of pleasure is really essential for our well-being. And it is part of liberation work. Adrienne Maree Brown says that pleasure is a measure of freedom. The people who are able to access and have the most pleasure are the freest people. And so in terms of like reading, I talk about in the conclusion of Body, Minds, Reimagined, I talk about pleasure because, you know, when I was first writing and working on this as a dissertation, there were people that were very like scoffing at it, right? That they were like, what? You know, I was doing these presentations where I was like, oh, I'm reading this paranormal romance series about a disabled werewolf. And people were like, you are never getting a job. You're never getting a job. Just so dismissive of it. And I think part of that was because I was enjoying it. I was really enjoying reading it. And I think that there's this association in the academy that we're supposed to be these brains that are like disattached from bodies that feel things, disattached from our emotions. And so you're not supposed to somehow be enjoying what you're doing. But I think most of us that got into doing academic work and research did it because we're nerds and we really like it. We like it. And I think that acknowledging and accepting that pleasure and speaking about that pleasure is really important in that academic space. But then in political spaces and organizing spaces, it's important because what we are working against and fighting against is so hard. It is so disheartening. It is so painful. And so we are the ones that have to ensure our joy and protect our joy and insist upon our joy. And that was really evident for me in the uprisings. And you saw the picture of me in this, one of my favorite like green dresses. Like I was wearing clothes that made me feel good when I was protesting. I was wearing some sparkly things. We had music. We had food that was good, delicious food that we would bring for people. We wanted folks to feel good and in community, even as we were fighting against something that was so traumatic and so painful. But we didn't want to be the ones to continue that trauma and continue that pain for one another. We wanted to bring that joy. And I think it is the only way that activists survive. I think too many of us get burnt out. Activists, academics, all of us are burnt out at this point in the pandemic. And so really embracing that joy and resisting that guilt that is so often associated with it is one of the first steps to kind of doing this work of pleasure activism. Then it becomes like, how do I encourage and create the joy for other people, kind of kill the pleasure police in my head. Like I think all of us have the pleasure police in our head that's like, oh, that's not what you're supposed to be doing when other people are experiencing pleasure. And that has all kinds of roots for different people, depending on who you are. I was raised Catholic, so, you know, that has its own roots. But yeah, it's really an important part, that joy, that pleasure. Adrienne Maree Brown refers to pleasure, like understanding pleasure is as deep satisfaction. Like what's the thing that is deeply satisfying? And so joy is a part of that, but I also want to make clear that sometimes anger can be deeply satisfying. Crying can be deeply satisfying. So it's not simply about emotions, all positive emotions, right? It's not good vibes only. It is this larger thing about feeling that deeper satisfaction and being able to be satisfied. So pleasure here is, good feelings. That's what we're aiming for, but it is not good feelings all the time. It's a recognition that sometimes working through the hard things, doing hard work is also pleasurable. It's also satisfying. It's just pleasurable, perhaps in a different way.
Thank you. And that really chimes with things that I think other people have been talking about throughout this conference as well. The opening roundtable, there was lots of discussion about the pleasure and personal investment that we bring to our own work, whether that be academic work or political work or the place where those things intersect, and kind of naming that and owning that as something that motivates us and something that can make the work sustainable and worthwhile. So thank you so much for that answer. Kind of jumping off that point, we have another question from an attendee who says, I feel like I've just lost all ability to fight in America. It seems like we're gleefully running towards fascism. Do you think we have a greater responsibility as academics to be bodily involved in politics?
I think it depends on what you mean by bodily involved. So I talked about being in the streets, and for me in that moment, it felt like the only thing that made sense for me to do. But I also was not, that picture of the line of police. I was not out there in the early days when there were tanks in the streets of Madison. I am a fat disabled person. If we are running from cops, I am screwed. I'm the first one getting picked up. So I wasn't out there in those moments. I was out there in the moments that worked for my body, worked for what was possible and safe enough for me. And so I think that when people talk about like, how do we get involved in politics and political change, I think a lot of it is being connected to your communities to know what's going on, where you can make a direct impact, and knowing your skills and limits. If you are a single parent, you shouldn't be out there trying to get arrested if no one's going to be able to take care of your kid. Something else has to happen for you. So, we had people who were just doing grocery runs. All they were doing was going to the grocery store and getting food and water and dropping them off. Other people were donating money. Other people were helping us, watch the police scanners. So there were lots of ways to be involved. And so bodily meaning like, do you have to be in the streets? No, you don't have to be in the streets. But I think as academics, if you are doing research and have information that is valuable and useful, that is one of our responsibilities. So we have the ability to distribute information outside of these paywalls that so much of our work is hidden behind. We are able to share information in virtual venues and putting it out in other ways, maybe translating it if your work is really hard to understand, making it more accessible literally in terms of comprehension. I also think that as academics, we can offer our research skills. Sometimes not everything is protests in the streets, right? So one of our local organizations was trying to get cops out of schools, the same organization I mentioned, Freedom Inc., getting cops out of schools in Madison. And one of the things they wanted to do was research who was interacting with police the most, who was getting kicked out the most. And it was academics at the university that were like, oh yeah, we have those skills. We can offer you the skills of doing the research so that you have the data to bring people and these arguments that you're bringing to the school board, right? So thinking about what are my skills, what are the things that I can offer, and how can that actually be used in an activist setting, in an organizing setting, and not just thinking I have to be out there with a protest sign, is where I think those of us with very particular skill sets as what we have as academics is really, really important. So don't get caught up in it has to look a certain way or it has to be like Instagrammable. It might not be. It might not. A lot of the work of organizing is not Instagrammable work. It is not things that you're going to be able to share in any kind of public way. That I shared a very small glimpse of what was happening in Madison, right? So yeah, I think that we do have a responsibility to be involved. Yes, I do believe that. But what that looks like is really dependent on your skills, your capacity level, the safety that you have. For me as a person that has a pretty public profile, particularly in Madison, it did feel a little bit safer to me because I felt like if I did get arrested, people were going to notice. People were going to not, I wasn't going to get caught up in a system that was going to disappear me in the way that we did have folks that we couldn't find for a while, but I didn't think it was going to happen to me because of my profile. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but I felt a little bit safer. So yeah, really thinking about that is an important aspect, and then deciding where to intervene. And yeah, really working with folks that are local and on the ground to say, like, what are the things that you actually could use support on, rather than creating your own thing wholesale. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, I think those conversations can sometimes be so important as well, because activism can often, speaking for myself, to me, it can sometimes seem like this big abstracted thing. And so actually taking those practical considerations into account and just having those conversations locally and on the ground can, be so helpful. So thank you. Meg asks, I speak to a lot of people and feel myself that maintaining hope is really difficult in present circumstances. How do you stay hopeful in protest and political work? And does your work in speculative fiction in particular engage or help with that?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. There's a couple of ways that I really am able to maintain hope. One is I use the work of T.L. Lewis, who's one of the activists that I interviewed for the new book, Black Disability Politics. And in the book, I quote T.L. as talking about having a different metrics of success. T.L. works with HEARD, which is an organization that focuses on folks who are deaf and hard of hearing, who have been incarcerated, who need help with getting accommodations, because it's not necessarily guaranteed that you will have someone who signs or that you have access to make a phone call in an accessible manner, right? All they have to do is provide a phone call, not something that is accessible for you. And so if you're doing work with primarily disabled folks of color in the criminal justice system, that's a huge and daunting thing. You're not going to change that whole system overnight. And so TL talks about the importance of when fighting against these huge systems that seem immobile, right? That we need a different metric of success. And I won't be able to quote it directly, from memory, but essentially TL says something to the effect of, how many families have you reunited? How many people have you provided another day outside the walls? Paying attention to the small things is essentially the thing of, you have to count every single win as a win, no matter how small it is. And so for me, that sometimes comes through the small wins locally. It also comes through my teaching. I really try to bring politics into the classroom. And so every time a student is like, after your class, I look at the world differently. I can't stop seeing ableism in the world now. And I'm like, oh, cool, I did it. I made you see the thing. And that is the first step to changing a thing, is actually being able to recognize that it's happening, right? So all of those are wins. That's one of the ways that I hold on to hope, is paying attention to those small wins. I keep every email that a student sends me that says, this is how you impact me or change, the things that I'm doing in my own, career now. Also for me, it's staying really in touch with young people. I mentioned at the beginning of this, I'm here to visit younger cousins. And so, one of them is queer and trans and disabled. And it really helps me to be in touch with younger people, to be like, okay, if nothing else, I got to keep doing it for them, because they have to live with this. So maybe I can make it a little bit better than it was for me, in whatever ways. So those are some of the ways that I hold on to hope, staying connected to younger folks, paying attention to those individual wins. And then just remembering, I think sometimes for me, that statement that I'm I am speculative fiction, I try to remember how different it was, so I think about how different it was when I was 14 and being okay, there has been something, right? So I think it's easy for us to be we got here and now it should just be better. But to remember that we have to keep paying attention, we have to keep fighting and pushing for it to keep happening. And so remembering that change has happened within our lifetimes and change can continue to happen within our lifetimes is the way that I hold on to that hope. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are unfortunately at the end of our time. I know that people have tons more that they probably want to discuss about your talk. But thank you so much, Sami, for giving your time and your expertise to us. As Dimitra was saying earlier before we went live with the webinar, we have really enjoyed drawing on your work as a resource for our research and teaching here at Glasgow. So it's been fabulous to have you with us today. So a reminder that if you'd like to continue our discussion, feel free to join us on our Discord channel or on Instagram or Twitter. Links to that have just been posted in the chat. And we hope that you'll join us for our final panel session at 6:25 BST. So huge thanks once again to Dr. Schalk. And we hope to we hope to see everyone at our final panel session.